if you're a woman in AI and you might feel maybe not welcome, you might feel not taken seriously, to really just keep in mind that it's not you, that in all likelihood is the environment. And so even if you feel a need to change yourself, and even if you feel a need to strategize about everything you say and everything you do, just keep in mind that that's not the way things should be, and this is an environment that is maybe in some ways somewhat hostile, and so it's not you, it's them, basically.
Naila, thanks very much for joining us today. Really grateful to have you on the show.
Thanks, Mark, for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Perfect. So let's kind of dive right in, kind of tell us where you're geographically located at the moment in the world, and what you're trying to do at Facebook AI Research or Meta AI Research. I guess we don't know yet.
Right, sure. So right now I'm in London. Like somewhere in the city center in London. I moved here about a year ago to start really my new role at Meta now. And at Meta, so I work in Meta's AI research organization. And so there, what I do is I, basically help to foster, create a nice research environment for different researchers, engineers specifically, because my team of research engineers works with research scientists and many other kind of partners to do, a pretty wide variety of research projects. And so our AI research division in particular is very, where I work within there is very bottom up. So it's a very exploratory space where researchers, be they engineers or scientists, come together to work on problems that they think are important and they think are going to be impactful. So basically I sort of help to foster the right environment for that type of work. And then also I'm hands-on in some work myself. And so some of the things I'm personally interested in are very much related to weak supervision, which has a very long and storied history in machine learning in general. And the idea is just how can we do more with less data, more or less.
That's very similar to Dr. Timothy Hospidalis's work on meta-learning type stuff as well.
Indeed.
Very cool.
Yeah.
So tell us a bit more about research engineers versus a researcher and how that kind of works sort of in a big production research setting.
Sure. So number one, I would like to say that at least in my point of view, I've always been in relatively small scale labs. So before I started working for Meta, I was in another lab that was, it was first Xerox's research lab in Europe. It was called Xerox Research Center Europe. And then that lab got acquired by a Korean company called Naver. And we were never very big. We were in the order of hundreds. And FAIR is also in the order of hundreds. So I wouldn't say it's necessarily very big. And I think that even though if you ask folks in Meta AI, like the research org, how it feels bigger, certainly, because we've been growing quite a lot. But still, I would say, in absolute numbers, it's not a lot. So it still, for me, feels like a relatively small scale kind of environment where where you can kind of know, almost everybody and interact with people.
So 100 and something is small in your mind.
So within on the order. So I would say it's on that order, basically.
Understood.
So we're not thousands. So, for me, that still seems relatively intimate. So in terms of, researchers, research scientists, research engineers. So at the end of the day, a lot of the work we do, it's hard to make a very strict boundary between these things. Okay. I call basically all of these folks researchers, and then you can kind of specialize more into research science, which might be more in terms of formulating new theorems, formulating new, hypotheses and validating those. And then you have research engineers who are, let's say research engineering is a bit more on the experimental side, and then you can go even more into the engineering side of things, which is more building frameworks, building libraries, helping to accelerate research, basically. Yes. So there are these types of different works, and different people, depending on where you are in that kind of spectrum, you might call yourself one thing or the other, but most people do a bit of both, I would say.
Okay. And you still code on a day-to-day or one?
Not on a day-to-day, that's for sure. Not on a day-to-day. Maybe on a month-to-month.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good to know. And that's something I've always been kind of curious about about as you kind of progress your career as a research manager? How much of those skill sets you still get to sort of do yourself versus learning by osmosis from your teammates, I imagine?
Yeah, I would say it depends very much on people. I don't think there's a one size fits all there. Certainly, yeah, I mean, there are different modes of things. I know some folks who are very senior, more senior than me even, and who code maybe, I don't know if day to day, but certainly week to week. And then there's some folks who don't code at all. So there's, you have kind of everything once again.
There's a good mix. Okay, good to know. Yeah. So we do the show to encourage people from the Caribbean region to pursue what we like to call data-driven careers. And I think we're trying to expand that even more to tech, just because without tech, you can't necessarily do machine learning and data engineering and all the fun stuff. So can you share with us your view of how tech machine learning will play a role in the Caribbean's economic and just future in general? And more specifically, can you highlight maybe something that high schoolers should look out for, college students, and then professionals that are there?
Right. So I'm not sure I'm going to give a very satisfying answer here, but what I would say is, I think folks have to, more than anything, be agile and be flexible, because I don't feel like I'm in a position to make any reasonable prognostics about what the future is going to be like and things like that. I do think that there are certain basics that it's good to know if you're interested in this space, and I think that tends to be a lot of fundamentals, right? A lot of fundamentals kind of on the more, let's say, STEM side of things, so mathematics basics and things like this. I also think it's important to have a good humanities grounding as well, to kind of put this stuff in context of different societies. So I think those kinds of fundamentals are important, but I wouldn't go as far as to say, it's important to look out for robotics, or it's important to look out for something else, because I think, honestly, I personally don't feel in a position to say that. But I do think, at least thinking about potentials for things, I think that if you're interested in data science and machine learning, I think there's a lot of opportunity. I don't know how that will be realized, but I do think there's a lot of opportunity in a lot of things that can be very impactful for the Caribbean. So, sustainability, environmental management, agriculture, healthcare, and this is honestly it's not specific to the Caribbean, right? So it's, I don't know if there's anything I would say that I think is like particularly Caribbean specific, but I do think that we, that folks within the Caribbean can play a big part in this as well.
Great. And within your network of people at home, do you see more people sort of gravitating towards this field and finding opportunities globally, or do you still find it a little more geographically or locally centric in terms of, all right, if I'm a data scientist in Trinidad, if I'm a tech person in Trinidad or the Caribbean, like you can only find jobs around there, if that makes sense?
So do you mean that folks who kind of have a base and have had like their prior experience in the Caribbean, whether they're able to expand beyond that, or? Yeah,
if you know of anyone in your network, at least, as you were gathering data points to some degree,
right,
that are they live there, but they're hired globally, essentially. That's the kind of, just curious about that, actually.
So I personally don't think I know anyone who's based in the Caribbean, who's physically, but who's working kind of, remotely, let's say. That being said, I do think that I think there's a potential for an inflection point here, like in this current environment we're all in, where people are, I think many tech companies are becoming more and more, I can certainly say Meta is becoming more and more, not just comfortable, but really leaning into distributed teams. And I think there are a lot of regulatory and legal and tax related implications for having folks not, in places that you're not in a very distributed place, like, distribution. But if we were to, I think there's a lot of appetite for working through that and trying to give people more flexibility. And I think that is exciting for, the Caribbean, but then for many other places that are sort of less connected historically.
Makes sense. Yeah, no, I've been seeing some more job applications pop up where you'll be working in the US, but you live at home, and folks are starting to expand that in the Caribbean, which is quite interesting. So in the first segment of the show, we typically like to deep dive into your career journey, and the true purpose is to, grab another data point of success on the machine learning ladder, so to say, on the map. So can you tell us kind of where you grew up at home and what you're like in high school in terms of your disciplines, interests, strengths, weaknesses? I was a slacker, so just kind of putting that out there. And I seem to have done okay, but just curious about your background.
Sure. So I was not a slacker. I was quite
Cool.
the nerd. So I grew up in Arima. I grew up in Santa Rosa Heights. My family is still there. Like a lot of my family is still there. I went to primary school in St. Joseph's Girls RC.
Mm-hmm.
And then I went to St. Joseph's Convent right next door. So I spent, I don't know, what's that, 14 years or something like that of my life there.
Yes.
Which I have, it was honestly for me, when I think back to my childhood and my secondary school experience, I thought it was really, I have no complaints. It was pretty idyllic.
Mm-hmm.
And then in terms of what I was like, I certainly was rather nerdy. So I spent a lot of time reading books and things like that. My mom would always tell me when we were looking for gifts for me when I was a kid, and she'd be like, Naila, don't you want to get like a nice like dress or something? I'm like, no, give me a book. So that's like sort of like the nerdy part. But that being said, school was I did, it's not like I had no struggles. I always remember when I was in Form 4, because I was considering, so when I was doing my O-levels, I did kind of a typical science track. So I did physics, maths, chemistry, computer science, actually.
Cool.
Yeah, which was I think, not many people were doing that at that point. And then all, English, lit, English language and stuff like that. And I remember I was doing maths, and it was really struggling. Like the first few months I started doing it in Form 4, I was like, I don't understand anything that's going on. And then, so my mom, which is where privilege comes in, we had, let's put it this way, I had the resources, my family had the resources to get me a very good tutor to do lessons outside. And, that just flipped a switch. Like I just had a great tutor who took me for a few months and just explained a few concepts to me. I don't even remember the details now, but I do remember the before and after. And it was like night and day, and I think back to that a lot of times, because I just think about, did I not have that? What my path could have been very different. I could have been frustrated and decided just to do something else. So it's just interesting how just one person can just change, something to that degree. Yeah. So that was kind of like probably like my biggest bump in the road in high school, at least academically. But then, but other than that, convent was a great environment. I made great friends. It was everybody was just very, very academically minded as well. So it was, you felt like you're around like-minded people. So I honestly, I
very
really
productive environment, it seems like.
Yeah, but very fun too. I was like, we didn't have time to have fun.
And you gravitated towards the sciences for what inherent reason? Did your parents kind of guide you to that, or did you kind of have an affinity to that from all of your voracious reading, it seems?
That's a good question. I think I was always very into sci-fi and fantasy and things like this. And also into things like astronomy. My father was a big sky gazer. He was really into that sort of thing. So I used to do, a fair bit of that with him. And so I think just because of that, I was always very interested in physics and just the world and nature, basically. So I think I was driven a bit to kind of natural sciences from that point of view. And then computer science was a bit of the oddball. And that once again was because of a teacher who was just a great teacher. Shout out to Mrs. Khan. So I was in Form 3 and I did computer science with her. Or maybe it was programming. I don't know what exactly it was called, but basically something around that. And I just really I just enjoyed it. And so I had to choose whether I was going to do biology or whether I was going to do computer science for O-levels. And I just decided, I'm enjoying it. I don't have any particular disposition for biology. And so I just, I went in that direction.
Seemed to have worked out.
Yeah. It's funny. It was very random. Like a lot of my decisions are very, very just exploratory, curiosity driven, not really with a very fixed thing in mind. So
that's good to note. And I think as I looked over your LinkedIn, it seems many of your moves were extremely strategic. So that's kind of cool that you're sort of highlighting.
You're the second person who told me that recently. And I was like, how am I given this impression? I was like a particle experiencing Brownian motion, like entirely.
I would say that the one, when we get to it, the jump from Princeton to when you went to Barcelona, Universitat how do you pronounce that?
Autónoma.
Universitat
Autónoma.
So I think that was maybe, but even if that does seem quite strategic, you're like, all right, I don't want to be cool. I'm going to go to.
Well, we can get to that. I can tell you how that came about.
Cool. All right, good. So you you got to Princeton and you decided to pursue electrical engineering. And from what you're sharing now, you had this background in computer science and sciences. So how come you chose electrical engineering? I know sometimes schools, the computing department might live within the electrical engineering department. And for folks at home, kind of tell us how you were able to sort of get to Princeton, what that application process was like, and then we'll get into, what that world was like.
Sure. So so once again, right? Strategic. Let's discuss this. So, so when I was in doing A levels, I looked around and I saw, and you will see, we might get to like similar themes in the future. And I saw all my friends who were applying doing SATs. And I was like, should I be doing SATs? Everybody's doing SATs. So I did what everybody was doing because I wasn't thinking very far ahead. So I was sort of like, I'll let people do this thinking for me. I'll use the wisdom of the crowd. And so I applied for medical school in UAE because so many people were doing that. And then I applied to various schools in the US because that was another thing. And I didn't really know, right? So I was the kind of person, I'm very open to anything. So I just said, let me just try and see what happens, and I'll figure out how I feel once things comes in. So I applied to those things. And when you apply to US schools, you don't usually apply to a department straight away. So I think, if I remember, this is going way back, but I think you might have had to put a preference at some point, but it didn't really matter, So I didn't have to make like a very firm decision in my mind, at least for US schools, in terms of what I would eventually want to do. Whereas, in Trinidad, I had to apply for a specific department. So I did that because, I was definitely interested in doing something in the sciences. And in terms of how that came about, like I said, it's just kind of like my natural curiosity in that direction. And then, so I made these applications. Actually, I did my SATs I think it was after I had done my A's. So I had taken a gap year. So between...
Oh, you did?
Yeah. Cool. So between high school and Princeton, I spent a year working in maritime.
Oh, fantastic!
I worked in maritime as an administrative assistant for the in-house council. That was interesting. And so during that period, I took the time. I just took my time. The job was not particularly time intensive, so it wasn't like I had to do a lot of juggling. And I did my applications. I had to go, ask for recommendations for people in school, and other people did some interviews. Had to write a few, I guess what you might call more motivational essays about, what you're passionate about, that sort of thing.
Yes.
And that was it, I sent in the application package, which had all these materials. So your grades, like your transcript,
all the extra certificates,
like your essays, your recommendations, all these things. You just put it together, send it. And then I heard back, and luckily I was accepted to Princeton.
Very cool.
And several others, and I decided to go to Princeton because they had a great department in electrical engineering. Because at that point I had decided that's probably where I would focus. And why did I focus on that? And that was because I at that point, at the end of my A levels, I had done physics. I'd done physics, chemistry, maths, and I guess I don't remember what the last one is. The one that everybody has to do.
GP, probably, right?
Exactly, right. And I just loved physics. Yeah, I just loved physics. I just really enjoyed it. And you might ask yourself, so why didn't you do physics? And the reason I didn't do physics actually was because I thought to myself, that seems, number one, rather intimidating at that level. But then number two, equally importantly, I just didn't know what I was going to do with that. It just didn't seem like a practical thing to do. I told myself, if I do that, the only thing I could imagine with a physics degree was teaching. And I wasn't particularly interested in teaching. So I thought, what is practical, but still has elements of that? And then I thought of electrical engineering because it does have, there's a lot of physics involved as well. And it's something I could see myself having a lot of options, because once again, I was always very interested in having options. So this seemed like a good way to do that.
So I'm happy that you brought up, it seems so far that your moves are not that strategic, and you do have this exploratory type personality, it seems like, at least so far. And I thought what was very cool is you took the gap year and just kind of just explored. And I think for folks that are in high school, that's an interesting strategy. I didn't necessarily take a gap year. It was like, you finish school, hurry up, apply for SATs, go, because time is slipping. And I'm looking out for those threads of just sit back and watch and see kind of what's happening and where you decide to sort of take a career. And the other thing I wanted to highlight was you mentioned you like having options, which is such a great thing. And I think that was one reason I chose chemical engineering. I was like, well, okay, they get paid the most. I have no clue what the heck I want to do. And if I have to come back to Trinidad, they have oil. So, okay, chemical engineering it is. And I had the ability to do sort of all those. So very practical, similar to sort of what you just described. And tell us what Princeton was like. So you get there and you are academically inclined. You've been reading a lot, which I think is a common thread that I've sort of gathered from a lot of the other interviewers who have made their careers in research. They tend to sort of read a lot. And yeah, tell us your experience at Princeton. Were you on par with everyone else, or was there this big jarring gap of, oh wow, I thought I was smart, but these students are, on different level?
So I would say that it was jarring. It was jarring for different reasons. I wasn't below average.
Cool.
If anything, I would say I was above average. The funny thing is when I went in Princeton, they do a thing where they give you credits. You can get credits coming in, right? So basically, when you have to do a degree, you have certain prerequisites you have to do. And you might be able to come in and say, I've already filled those prerequisites. I'm ready to go to the next level. And so A levels, the kind of, I think I did Cambridge A level certificates. And those went towards fulfilling some of like the basic requirements. So for example, I didn't have to do intro physics. I didn't have to do certain other things. And then I remember I had, because everybody is assigned, when you're a freshman, everybody is assigned like an undergraduate advisor for your first month or year, or semester or year. And I remember my advisor told me, he's like, you had a great education.
Yes.
So that just goes to show, nobody needs to feel intimidated coming from, if you've had the luck to go to a good school in Trinidad, which I did. So from that perspective, no, I wasn't in terms of like putting me like with respect to other peers, like I wasn't below average, I would say. I was struggling more than anybody else. Let's put it that way. But it was a gap. I think it was like a leap, and I think it was a leap for a lot of people, right? So not for everybody. Some people definitely came in with more preparation than I did, but many people came in with less preparation than I did. So a lot of people had to struggle. I certainly found my first year a struggle in some places. There were some things that there were some courses I was like, whoa, this is just a lot of work. Also because that's one thing, right? So the workload is very different. I think it feels like you form 5 or form 6 or upper level form 6, but all the time, right? So you don't have the times in between where you can just absorb. It's you're basically kind of constantly churning out stuff. Like in the same way, when you're doing A levels, or you have to do like practicals, and you have to do this one and that one. You just have every week you have what they call continuous assessment, and that was something in Trinidad we don't do, right? We have like more the British system where you have like a year to really absorb things. Okay, you might have some stuff by terms, but they don't really matter. Like the two biggest things that really count happen just basically twice in when you're like 15, 16 and 17, 18. So that was different because it felt like you had to be continuously on. And that was not something I was used to, that kind of continuous pace of just constantly absorbing material. So that was a shift. And I actually spent a year in Oxford, and that was a shift back to what I was kind of more used to. And that I had a really great, honestly, to be honest, I think it fit me better, like that. That learning style. So it was just, but I was not the only one. I remember I had a friend, I have a friend. She continues to be like a great, one of my closest friends. And she was, a lot of people in Princeton are very, very high achievers, right? Of course. And for a lot of people, they came in with this mentality of, oh my gosh, I'm struggling. This is, should I be here, etc. I never had that thought. Or at least, it was not like a big struggle in my head, but I did have other people who struggle with that as well. So it is a common thing. I think many people feel it. I don't know if many people talk about it, but I think there are very few people who go to Princeton and think, oh, this is easy. This is fine.
Yes. And it seems, I've talked to several people who've come from like the Ivy League schools, and they've kind of gone into research and whatnot. And one of the things that I've noticed is the sort of base level of what you think is possible tends to be a lot higher, or the level of optimism that you have about sort of what you're doing tends to be a lot higher at the larger, more well-known institutions versus like a small school where those may exist maybe in more pockets versus like that's the norm that students think about. So I kind of wanted to at least just gauge what your experience was like when it comes to that. So.
Yeah, I mean, to touch on that a bit more, like I definitely think that what was one of the best things about Princeton for me, and there are many great things. One of the best things was that, as you kind of said, like maybe in a different context, it really opened for me like a lot of different opportunities to have different experiences, and then also to have a very well-rounded education, which I really valued. I valued having what they call a liberal arts education, where I didn't only focus on, because I'm doing electrical engineering, I'm only going to do STEM subjects, right? I was required to do humanities subjects. And that was some of the most enriching, courses that I did. And so that I experienced, I appreciate it a lot as well.
Very cool. And were you thinking a lot about your career as you got closer to the end of your undergrad? So you have this super practical electrical engineering degree that you're preparing for, and kind of tell us maybe how your mindset shifted, if it did, or were you still sort of exploring, all right, let me just get through this, get to the end, and I'll see kind of what happens after that.
Yeah, this is there's a lot of, there's a lot here. So I would say that I went into Princeton being rather naive, right? So I went into Princeton sort of like, well, it's a great school. They gave me a great scholarship package. They're very supportive of me financially. It's going to be a nice adventure. And I think many people went to Princeton with what you're describing, right? With a very targeted view of what they wanted to achieve. And I was not that person. So I in my junior year, I did a study, like an exchange program with University of Oxford. And because I thought, oh, I would, I've always wondered what it would be like, to study in Oxford. It seems really nice. Let me go try that out. Oh, wow, Princeton is going to like give me this opportunity and arrange this to me. Amazing, right? Didn't think about what would it mean, etc. And then I came back, and then it turns out that all my friends had, like, basically half of my friends already had jobs for when they're going to leave Princeton, right? Because you might be aware that in the US it's very typical, especially when you're somebody who's in a STEM, who's like an engineer, computer science, that you do a series of internships, like maybe in the summer of your sophomore year, your junior year. And then normally you're looking to get what they call a return offer, right? So basically the year before you graduate, you do an internship with a company. And that company, if they thought, if it was a great fit, then they would give you an offer. And then the last year, you know exactly what you're going to do afterwards. I had no idea about any of this, right? So I came back and all my friends were like, I am applying to this place. Oh, I already have my job. And I was like, oh my gosh, I have no idea what I'm going to do. Everybody but me knows what I'm going to do, what they're going to do. So like I say, this is what I mean when I say there's a trend. So I was like, okay, everybody's applying to go to banking. I should apply to go to banking.
That makes sense.
And then so I applied to go to banking. At the same time, though, when I was in Oxford, I did do a research project that I quite enjoyed. It was more of an engineering project, to be honest, but it was the kind of project that just allowed you to do a lot of exploration and try different things. And it started to give me a bit of a taste for research. And when I came back to Princeton for my last year, I did kind of embed myself in a research group with a professor who had a research group. And so then I started to get a bit curious about, oh, this looks like a fun thing to do, like for an extended period of time, right? I wasn't doing a ton myself, but I was sort of observing them, like watching them like read papers and like discuss ideas. I thought, oh, that sounds really fun. Just like reading interesting like works and ideas, and coming up with new algorithms for things. So that started to pique my curiosity as well. So then once again, I started to be like, oh, I can go down these two paths. I can maybe explore this a bit further, the research side, or I can do finance. And finance was a bit, let's put it this way, like I got a position relatively quickly. Mm-hmm. And in terms of, I applied for a couple PhD programs at the same time, but not as seriously as I should have. So I didn't put in, I don't think, great applications. And so I didn't get through to anything I was interested in. So in the end, I decided to go that route. So I decided to go into finance, and I worked for a year. And that was also a great experience as well. at least in terms of, it wasn't like the most intellectually stimulating experience, but it was a great work environment. I made a lot of great, colleagues there, and it gave me time to really crystallize in my head like what I was interested in.
Okay.
And then so then eventually that kind of spurred me on to make a decision about doing a PhD. But that also was a bit random, actually, the final decision.
Yeah, the whole PhD part. So
Yeah.
I see you have the master's and the PhD. So you're highlighting PhD. So did you decide after you are a financial analyst at JP Morgan Chase, did you just decide, all right, I'm going to do a master's, and then you stumble upon the PhD? You're like, all right, I'm just going to do the PhD and just pull the master's out while I'm there.
Yeah, it's a good question. So at least in, there are different things, different kinds of, let's say, paradigms in different places. But in the program I had applied to was one where it was a scholarship program, and the expectation was that you would do a PhD, but that the first step to that would be to do a master's. So it came as kind of like a package deal. So it wasn't like I decided first to do a master's and then after to do a PhD. It was basically like a 4-year PhD where the first year you get a master's degree.
That's pretty sweet. How did you find it? Just online, just searching online? Did you have the school before? Or someone told you?
Yeah, this is once again extremely random. Sorry, it's just going to keep coming up.
Which is good.
So when I was in my senior year, like the professor whose team I was embedded in, he, Peter Ramage, shout out to Peter Ramage. He told me, he's like, oh, I know you're interested maybe in doing a PhD. There's a research group in Barcelona that I'm in contact with, and I know they're looking for a PhD student. Maybe you should apply. So I did apply. I didn't get in. And then I did not get in, no. And but at that point, I had kind of like, I had started to do the other option of going into finance. And then a year after, when I was a year into my finance role, I had to make a decision because I had to apply for, if I wanted to stay on, I would have to apply for an H-1B visa. And I did apply for it, and I didn't get it, right? It was a lottery, and the lottery didn't work out. So I had to figure out what to do. So I had a lot of great people internally who helped me find other positions externally. Yes. So I had a few options to kind of work like in London and Hong Kong, basically within JP Morgan, but to transfer internally. And at the point where I was kind of figuring out, okay, what would I want to do? So a different group within the Barcelona lab reached out to me because I guess my CV had circulated, and they were like, oh, we have a position. Are you still interested? A year later, are you still interested in doing a PhD? And this was literally I got this email from from someone who became my PhD advisor, Chavi Otazu. And this just showed up because literally if the email had come a week later, I'd have probably accepted a position somewhere else, and I would have been, who knows what I would have been doing now. So then this just dropped into my lap, and I thought, God, maybe this is a sign. I don't know. And I had a few discussions with different people. I spoke with my brother. I called him and I was like, oh, what should I do? And then I thought, you know what, like we discussed, and I told myself, I think the finance path will be there. The finance path will be there if I want it, but this seems very serendipitous. And I am kind of curious to kind of go to Barcelona. Why not? It sounds amazing. Yeah. Study for a while, a cool topic. It was very interesting what they were suggesting for me to work on. And I thought this is probably not going to come around again. So then I just made that decision.
All right. That's inspiring. And one of the things I wanted to ask when it comes to you reaching out, so you met your professor and you were just doing research with him, or you were just discussing, he was kind of like your advisor as your undergrad advisor? How did you kind of make that connection? And one of the things I like to highlight in the show is because of your Caribbean background to some degree, you can relate to many different people quite easily and form connections on many different levels. So was that present there, or you just knew this professor and that kind of worked out?
Yeah, no, I can't say that came. I do agree with your larger points about Caribbean people being like, having multiculturalism helping out. In this specific case, so it's I think basically every electrical engineer in Princeton has to do a research project. If I remember correctly. Do they have to? I'm not sure if they had to, but it was a very typical thing. So normally what you would do is, if you wanted to do a research project, you'd reach out to certain professors and say, because it would be sort of like a matching process where some professors would be like, if somebody wants to work on this, I have some options, and other people could be like, oh, I'm interested in this, and then you'd find a match. So it worked out that way. So it was not necessarily cold calling somebody, because there was like a structure in place, but at the same time, I didn't really know this professor very well before. But in Princeton, luckily enough, at least in my department, people were very open to, supporting folks who wanted to do a research project for a while. So that I didn't have any struggles finding somebody to work with there.
Great. And you mentioned your H-1B didn't sort of come through. Were you on your STEM OPT? And for
I was
those,
on the OPT.
Oh, you were?
Yeah.
So you're on your first year, and back then they didn't have
so
STEM?
back then there was no second year. Yes.
Wow.
Yes.
Damn.
Yes. There was just 1 year. There was definitely just 1 year.
Just the 1 year.
I think they changed that. I don't know when. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm very happy they changed that, because I went all the way to the end of my STEM before my green card sort of came through. And shout out to anyone who's thinking of getting a green card. PhD is a great route to sort of get it. That's one, and I think that was my guiding light for getting through it. And I don't know if I may share as much academic interests as yourself, but for me it was more about opportunity and, all right, I just have to sort of get this done. So now you're in Barcelona. You're doing your 1 year master's and 3 year PhD. Tell us what your relationship was like with your advisor. Was he super? What's the word? Super guiding, super cool. To tell us about that relationship. And the reason why I ask is, I think for anyone thinking of pursuing an advanced degree, choosing an advisor that you harmonize with is truly important.
Yeah. So once again, this was something that, I didn't go through a process of thinking very carefully through, which advice I'd want to work with. I got like an email, asking if I'd be interested, and I kind of jumped on it.
Yes.
So I did reach, and in the end, I had two supervisors. I worked with quite a few people during my PhD, actually. I had 2 main supervisors. And then I also spent quite a bit of time as a visiting researcher in France as well, in Grenoble. So that's, the relationship was, I would say, very collaborative. It was not, I would say I would summarize it as collaborative. It was neither kind of like very hands off, nor was it just do this, right? So,
okay.
And, very quickly we were able to just have discussions about things, like discuss ideas. If we all thought it made sense, go ahead. If we didn't, we'd discuss, and we basically converge on something and start working on that. So that was good. I don't know if it's typical. I suspect it's not typical, but it worked out, I think, relatively well. Also because I had wanted to spend some time in France as well. So they kind of gave me that autonomy as well. So that kind of also kind of just created an environment where it's sort of like, this is what I'd like to do, involve them when it made sense, when not.
That's exciting.
And they were all, they were all very, very supportive of that.
And you were in a lab as well, or it was just kind of one-on-one with your advisors, but they had other students as well?
No, so I was in a group. I was in a lab, you could call it. So maybe I can back up, actually. So there's like a research lab in Barcelona, well, in Catalonia, called the Computer Vision Center, and it's affiliated with the Universitat Autònoma de Barcelona. And so within this Computer Vision Center, it's once again a center with, on the order, at the time I was there, was probably around 150 people, divided into different research groups with different themes, right? Different thematic groups. There were some folks who were working on document understanding, visual document understanding. There are some folks who were interested in human modeling, like modeling human like shapes and behaviors. And then there was my team, my group that was called the Color and Texture Group at the time, which was, as the name implies, it was, researching color, and very specifically kind of color perception, and also texture perception as well. Although that, that wasn't like a huge focus when I was there. So I joined that group, and that group was like, so specifically my advisors were interested in creating, like building computational models of let's say, of perception that are kind of, let's say, biologically inspired, right? So trying to, and for example, we did a fair bit of work on using models to replicate visual illusions, like things like color illusions and things like this, and using those same models to see if they generalize to other problems. And so I did a lot of work on using to see if they generalize to human attention as well. So I did work with a team, and there were a team of, I don't know how many people, maybe 10 to 15 people, including PhD students like myself, postdocs, a mix.
Great. And were you really good at reading papers, or did you struggle with that, given your reading background?
Oh God, it's hard to think back to that. Did I struggle? I think, I mean, it's a learning curve. I wouldn't say I struggle. I think it's natural. I think anybody who doesn't struggle is a bit strange. I mean, you have to get used to the material first, right? It's like a whole, yes. You have to understand really well, like the existing literature, the kind of the baseline algorithms and, technologies and all that stuff that underlie it. And it takes time to kind of build that up. So I don't think there's any way to go through that without, having to do the work at some point. And then at a certain point, you get to a level of familiarity with all the used techniques and the different groups and what they tend to work on and the types of tools they tend to use. And then from that point on, it starts to become easier. But that takes a few years, I think.
Okay. And you still read a lot of papers today?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Cool. Yeah. Okay, you're like one of the first researchers that I've heard still actively do it. Like I interviewed Danielle, and she was like, she has the same guilt that I have, like, oh, we should be reading way more papers, but she gets a lot of it by osmosis.
I absolutely should be reading way more papers. Okay. I absolutely should be. I don't know. I think it's normal to feel like I'm not reading enough, but I still do read, like, every day, like, papers. But I don't read as much as I read when I was doing my PhD. That's for sure.
Okay, yeah. Before the interview ends, I'll make sure and suss out some paper reading strategies. I always find that quite interesting. So you got to the end of your PhD, right? You've finished it. Typically, PhD is a fairly brutal process to some degree in terms of you're trying to prove something that does not exist and defend it against people that like you, but they're putting up a wall to make sure that you are of high quality. So kind of describe to us what that end experience was like in terms of the combination of your work and your next leg of your journey into, I believe you went to Xerox straight after that, right? Correct?
I did, yeah. Yeah, so in my field of computer vision, and I think this generalizes pretty well to machine learning, at least, and in my day as well, because things have changed a little bit, the struggle was to get your first major piece of work. Mm-hmm. And that came way before the end of the PhD, right? So I remember I was in like halfway through my first year, and I had like a colleague, like a very dear friend who was super supportive. And he told me, it's like, Naila, you need to really get on this. You don't have that much time, and I don't know what you're doing. He's like, you can't, it's not going to happen at the end, right? You need to just get on this now and make this a priority right now to start working on something really concrete and something that could make it into like something impactful enough to be published. Let's say in a major venue. Mm-hmm. And so for me, the pressure was kind of on to some extent from that point on, but certainly in my second year, I felt like I needed to get something. I needed to get like some interesting results, right? I need to get some interesting results. So that was stressful, because as you know very well, when you're doing research, there's so much failure. There's just so much constant failure, right? So many ideas you thought this, why doesn't this work? So that was tough. But then luckily enough, I was able to make a breakthrough like somewhere in my second year, and I had a paper that was published to CVPR. And at that point, everybody was like, Naila, you're done. You have a CVPR paper. You're done. You can do better. But at that point, that's just crazy how the goalposts have shifted. At that point, it's like, oh, you have a CVPR paper, get like another one or two, like, it doesn't have to be that level, but on that order, and you'll be fine. So the pressure just eased off of me like so much at that point, right? So I was happy and lucky that kind of like it came on relatively early in my career that I had something that I could say, okay, I could really base my thesis around this. Mm-hmm. And then after that, I started doing, as usual, like, different things. So I had a friend who did an internship in Xerox, And he had a great experience there, and he suggested it to me because I was looking to do something a bit different, and he kind of passed my resume. So this is why, once again, having connections are just life in the world, for better or worse. And somebody there reached out to me and said, "Oh, we have this internship position. Are you interested?" And I interviewed for it. Luckily I got it. And then I spent the summer year there. And that was, I think, in the summer of, was it the end of my, no, I think it was the end of my second year, maybe. And I had a great time. And so they invited me back to spend a bit more time during my PhD. So in the end, and I think in like the third year of my PhD, I spent like a lot of time in France working on actually something pretty much entirely different. But I manage? Yeah, I think I managed to kind of get them together in the thesis at the end of it. So okay. Yeah. And then that's how I ended up going to Xerox eventually, because we just, I made some great connections. I had a really productive working relationship with some folks there. And so they asked me, I applied actually for a position there, and I got a postdoc position. And that's why I decided to move there right after the PhD.
Oh, great. So you did an industry-based postdoc.
I did.
That's quite incredible. So tell us, for folks listening, if they decide to choose the academic track, what was your experience like in your postdoc? And I've heard oftentimes that it's a nicer environment because there is the stress to publish, but it's also not dealing with all the class stuff. Maybe you might be doing some teaching, but it's really an interesting time to express your own creativity as a mature researcher.
Yeah, that's a great question. The way I look at it as somebody relatively from the outside, right? So I never had a postdoctoral or assistant professorship or anything like that, but I certainly know many people who do. And I think that for me, like an academic position is, it's like basically 3 different jobs. So you have to do research, you have to get money, you have to do grant writing and try to get your lab going, and then you have to teach, right? And those are all very difficult, challenging things in their own right. And I was never somebody who I enjoy teaching, but it's not like my passion, right? So I thought to myself, why would I want to go down a road where a big part of what I need to do is something that I'm not particularly passionate about? So that's why for me, the academic path was never one I really considered. Yes. And then on the industrial side, yes, doing a postdoc, I do think that's the thing, right? Luckily, I didn't have to fight for money internally. I didn't have to fight to kind of justify my salary or the salary of anybody else. So I basically just got to focus on the research. And as you say, it was like a nice time I was just 100% deep in research. I didn't have any other considerations. I didn't have to write any grants. I didn't have to teach, nothing. So that was great. On the other hand, I mean, it kind of depends on what your motivations are. If you're somebody who really wants to scale the work that you do, then I do think that academia is a good place to do that, because you scale the people who are doing research, because you're training people who go on to do research themselves. So you're just becoming a force multiplier. And those people can do things that interest you, right? And that is something that in industry is not as common, because normally in all the labs I've been in, right? And there are many different types of research labs. In the research labs I've been in, which do a lot of fundamental research, it tends to be very bottom up. And because of that, you're not going to be able to necessarily scale yourself in terms of research. So that's just a trade-off, right? So if you're somebody who says, I have like this big vision, and to do that, I'm going to need a big lab. It's not typical that in fundamental industrial research labs, you can scale your vision that way. So it's much more collaborative. And so you have to kind of share your vision with people. If you get lucky that other people share it, then that's great. But in general, it's not the same. So
you don't get to drive the vision. Essentially, you're a part of the team.
At least in the labs I've been, I think this is the case for many labs. You're not going to get assigned like a group of people to realize your vision for you, right? Like here's a team. They're going to work on what you say. That's not how it's ever worked in any place I've been.
Yes, and I'm taking a look at your LinkedIn here, and you're a research scientist, and you sort of rose the ranks within Xerox, and then, as you shared before, they were acquired by Naver. And sort of tell us about your progression through, I don't like to call them ranks, but through those different positions. I think one thing that strikes me as very interesting is researchers tend to be very, hey, leave out all of this like managerial stuff. Like, let me just focus on like the beauty of the work that I'm doing. But it seems like you took on the challenge of leading teams and leading divisions. So tell us kind of about that journey.
Right. So once again, this was something that it's not something I had planned for myself.
Okay.
I had not envisioned myself. I almost never applied for any of these positions. It was sort of positions that opened up and then people reached out to me to ask if I'd be interested in it.
Okay.
So because you're completely right? Like, I think it's definitely the case that research scientists tend to be people who just by the nature of the beast are very passionate about the work that they're doing and not really interested in compromising on doing and having kind of multiple hats, right? So because it's hard, right? For the same reason that, as I said, being in academia and having to juggle like different things, it's just it's a difficult thing to do. And in the same spirit, I mean, juggling being a manager and juggling being a researcher yourself and doing individual contributions, it's a struggle. It's one I've never felt like I've gotten a perfect balance on that. But I was interested in that. It was something that I felt was an interesting challenge to go from doing work yourself to kind of creating the right environment to do that and supporting people to do that and thinking strategically about what would make sense to do. How can I guide people if people want to be impactful? How can I how can I kind of guide them there if they want to think about what are things I should be working on? So that's what I was that was what motivated me to kind of accept these roles. But once again, it was not necessarily something that I pushed for. It just happens to be the case that I think I was lucky to find myself in places where there was they tended to just be a lot of opportunity.
Yes.
A lot of growth. And when you're in a place that's growing, opportunities just naturally keep falling, right? They just keep coming. So,
and in those opportunities, as you sort of had more and more responsibility through your different roles, kind of tell us about what you've found to be sort of the sweet spot for these types of environments that you try to create for the researchers that you work with, and more so how you have dealt with managing researchers that are more senior than yourself, probably, right? Where they may have been there for a while, but they're focused on something very specific, but you're looking more at a broader vision.
So I try to be. That's a great question. I try to be very collaborative in my approach. I'm humble. I'm not afraid to just admit the facts, which is that you know way more about what you're doing than I do, and I'm not going to come in here and tell you. So what I try to do is not necessarily say I think your idea is good or bad, right? Because they will know that better than me, especially folks who have more experience than me. But it's more to make connections and to help folks see opportunities that they may not have seen simply because I have more context. So the thing is, like, what I think I bring in a large part is because there are folks focused on going deep. I try to go broad and try to build connections. That might be connections to other researchers who are doing similar things. Maybe opportunities to deploy something that you're working on in a production system or something like that. Funding opportunities for presenting your work in different places. So just trying to make those connections so that what someone's doing can become a bit bigger, to help them land more impact, to help them align a bit better with the strategic opportunities or strategic objectives. So it's very much in that kind of role. It's what it's what is called in the business like servant leadership, this management style, where you're sort of there. You take a posture of, I'm here to help you do your best work. And I think for researchers, it's such a natural fit, right, to take that approach. Because at the end of the day, a researcher is somebody who has built like extreme domain knowledge over a long period of time. So and that's their job, right? Their job is to continue to build upon that body of work. So my job it becomes much different, right? It becomes, okay, how can I scale that? How can I help people increase even more the impact of, or even give them some hints into, this is something that at least the company finds strategic. If you worked on that, you might have an opportunity to deploy it internally if that interests you. So just to kind of surface some of those opportunities.
Makes sense. And I noticed you are also an advisory council member at Princeton University for the department, and kind of tell us maybe what led you to go back to your alma mater and kind of be that advisor. I imagine probably someone reached out once again. That seems to be a thread throughout your story based on your reputation, which is cool. I think that's something great to highlight, because you have such a great reputation. Sort of wherever you go, people are like, hey, we're going to ping Naila and ask if she's sort of interested. So any thoughts there?
Yeah, that's very kind. Indeed, that was the case. So somebody did reach out to me. And for me, it was a no-brainer. It was I really think, I had a great academic experience in Princeton and in Princeton engineering. It was a place where I was able to be just very intellectually curious, very open, work with people who are very passionate and who just have such deep knowledge on different things. So if someone comes to me and says, they came to me specifically because I work in AI, and they were looking for somebody who had good AI, like domain knowledge there and machine learning, etc., and also who's not based in the US. And because they knew that I was based in Europe and also that I'm working in ML, they were looking for that piece of their puzzle for their council, because the council, election engineering is very broad, right, and it touches upon many things. And they just wanted somebody who could give some perspective into how electrical engineering could be relevant for machine learning, of course, now. And I mean, it's clear in the ways it is, but maybe thinking forward, right? Like, what are the things that the department should be thinking about and looking towards? So this is why they reached out to me, and I was really happy to help.
Perfect. And you're at Facebook. Oh, Meta. I need to push it. Just like,
I'm still getting used to it too. I'm still getting used to it too. Don't worry.
And what led you to go to Meta now? And what's been sort of your experience in terms of, I've heard that the research culture, or just the culture of Facebook, moves very, very quickly. So how tell us the difference there.
Yeah. So I decided to go to Meta. Number one, because I was interested in moving a bit closer to family, and I have family in London. And so some folks so Meta reached out to me for a London-based position, and I decided to consider it. And then internally, it was not actually in where I am now. It was like a different, let's say, organization within Meta. And then eventually, after having like different discussions, interviews with people internally, they decided, like, the recruiter came back to me and was like, I think actually you'd be a good fit for this position within the research department. Are you interested? And I said I was. And then, he queued up some discussions for me with folks there internally. So I was sort of like once again, like I was, reached out to for this position. And I thought, oh, this could be interesting. Also, I mean, Meta, I mean, why did I eventually accept the position and keep going was because I was very, I mean, you can't help but be impressed by the work that comes out of Meta AI research. Well, the research team within Meta AI. It was very motivating to be able to work with these people. Like, they're very, they're at the top of the field, right? And I heard many great things. I knew many people internally, and they said that, not only is the environment like one where you just get to learn a lot and grow with just by the people who have such deep knowledge, but then also is a very collaborative environment. Like, folks were very generous, very kind, just good colleagues to have. And that was important for me too. And that has definitely been the case, I must say. So that was one thing. Also, I mean, it's a place where you could just have so much impact, right? It's very exciting to think to yourself, I'm going to be working on something that I went from working in companies that are not necessarily household names, like maybe in some places, to thinking of the fact that you're going to work on something where literally half the planet uses. It's very exciting, right? And I mean, there are a lot of work, there are a lot of things to be done. There's a lot of challenges that we need to solve. There's a lot of very exciting things that we want to build. And I was just, it's great to be a part of that, right? Like, and I love being part of a company that's so ambitious, like so crazy ambitious, right? Like, when we came out with our metaverse vision, I think, 80% of people are like, that's just a crazy thing. There's no way we can get it done. And I think the fact that we're like, well, we're going to try. I mean, that's what I really love about it.
Yeah, there's such a strong engineering culture at Facebook and at NVIDIA. I've noticed what's the word I'm looking for? Sort of the privilege that you have when you work at some of the top machine learning companies, when you get access to very large compute. And that does give you this ability to solve problems that you can't solve without that type of compute. So I find that quite interesting about Facebook AI and all the bigger research labs in industry. Great. In the second to last segment of the podcast, I'm going to ask for some advice on behalf of maybe some folks listening in different scenarios. So there will be a little curveball-y to some degree. What would you do to break into tech if you lived in the Caribbean? So, sort of put yourself there, and you have no tech background, no formal education. So I think this is actually the hardest question. And only a high school level of education, but you have a burning desire to succeed. And one of the main reasons I asked this question is, I think you mentioned a story where you were fortunate enough to have an ad maths teacher that was able to shift how you saw that subject, and that allowed you to progress in a certain way. And there are many people that would never get access to that type of education. And I'm just trying to sort of surface, hey, what can they do in that scenario, right? There's the internet now, which didn't necessarily exist. I won't say the internet, but more education on YouTube.
A lot of like open source resources. Yeah.
So yeah, any thoughts there?
Yeah, so as you say, I don't know if I'm best placed because I came up in like a different environment. What I would say is kind of, yeah, just to reiterate what you just said. So for me, I think eventually, I think there's kind of different approaches you can take depending on where you are, right? So, but eventually where you want to get to is a point where you have some kind of track record.
Mm-hmm.
This is what you're always going to need to build up, right? A track record. So I think the question, like the North Star for people should be, I mean, in my opinion, that I would take would be, okay, what do I want to achieve? What track record do I want to build? What do I want to demonstrate? And how can I gain that experience? And then from there, you can think a bit about, where are the different places I can get that. If you're somebody with no formal education, then yeah, I think, as you surface, you'd have to try to get that somewhere. And I do think that there are a lot of very good resources online. And I think there's lots of online communities where you can get on similar journeys with different people. And that's something that was not around when, at least as far as I know, in my day. But I think now there are so many different communities of people who are trying to learn the same thing and take the same path. And so you can come together and create your own study groups, follow online courses, and find these communities like in Reddit or in Discord channels or different things like that. So I would really encourage people to look out for those things because I think even if you're somebody you're just starting out and you need to really get, like, for example, the basics of computer science or even the basics of like statistics and calculus and things like this. I'm sure if folks looked out now, they can find some community of online folks who are like, let's do a study group together, let's go through this course together. There are researchers who do that now, right? So it's a very common thing I think in most academically inclined or research inclined organizations that people are always learning, right? I shouldn't say it's typical. It's a fact that people are always learning. And what's typical is that it's very common for folks to say, okay, we think that, for example, graph neural networks are going to be a big thing, right? Of course they are now, but let's imagine 5 years ago you were saying that. And then researchers who are at the top of their field, right, who are renowned in some area or another would say, okay, I don't really know enough about this. I want to learn about it. Do you want to do a study group? Wow. And then within the industrial lab, all of these very well-renowned researchers would come together and go through a book together. They would invite folks who are experts to come and give them talks, and they would learn about it just like anybody else. So I think there's no need to feel like this is something that, number one, is something that you're going to have to do throughout your career. So might as well get started now. Create communities of folks, find those communities, and really leverage them.
I appreciate you calling out the community aspect. And I think in the whole NFT space, I'm like this deep into NFTs
really?
now. Oh yeah, I'm completely down the rabbit hole. And I think one of the things that interests me, other than the art, right? Because when you think of, okay, what's the utility of this picture that you may or may not own to some degree, wherever it's stored, is the community aspect and the strength of community. And I think, even you working at Facebook, now Meta, that was a fundamental building block, right? It is connecting multiple disparate communities sort of globally. So yeah, I like that aspect. And one other thing I wanted to highlight that stuck out to me in your story, when I look at your LinkedIn, you didn't plan any of this, and it sort of evolved, but it seemed like you were always primed at each step to take the next opportunity that sort of came, which is great. So I'll skip the next question that I had in terms of how you'd break into tech and machine learning, given that you had a technical degree, because I think we might have covered that a little bit in the beginning in terms of sort of where you saw the future going. But I'd ask maybe one for professionals now. So you're a professional in the Caribbean and you kind of want to break into tech and machine learning. And there are many different levels. I think in your side of the world, it's extremely technical, bleeding edge of get something to production that nobody else could, I guess. But what advice do you have other than maybe connecting with community for professionals in the Caribbean? currently?
Right. So other than community, I guess what I would say is, once again, I think the important thing to be, so let's imagine you're somebody who is working in, I don't know, you're working in, let's say, back-end infrastructure or in, user interfaces or something. And you said, okay, I want to get into ML. I want to become a machine learning engineer, machine learning scientist. I would say that, and if you wanted to get into the industry, right? Because academia is like a different thing. But if you wanted to eventually say, I want to be still in industry, but I want to be doing machine learning engineering rather than something else, then I think it's hard to, for me, I think an essential step is to once again build a track record at some point and then figure out how you want to do that. And you can take different strategies. So I know that there are paid positions, like there's, you can look for a position in a startup that's willing to kind of hire somebody who is going to learn on the job, as opposed to hiring somebody with a track record saying, I've already built these 5 systems, right? Or if you say, okay, I don't want to do that route, I want to maybe keep my job and do something and part-time, then I think you would have to start to build up some kind of portfolio, right? So that could be contributing to open source projects, right? Contributing to SciPy or something like that. Finding places where you can start to say, hey, I have a passion for this, and you can see it because I'm working on it actively. And if you can kind of show some record of this. So so I think once again, it's kind of like building that track record of interest and experience. And then depending on how far along you get, you can apply for positions that require less or more experience. And I think it's hard to get in with nothing, but I think once you start to show some basic results in the form of things that you've implemented, then you can start to apply to places with different level of expectations, and then learn within that environment.
Perfect. In the last segment of the podcast, we've gotten a deep dive of your career journey so far. And you're an explorer, which I find very interesting that, you sort of lead these research teams now as maybe the guide of explorers, let's call it that. And
it's probably too much, but yeah, sure. the co-pilot maybe.
So there's this book called So Good They Can't Ignore You. And in that book, the author argues that you shouldn't necessarily follow your passion to some degree, right? Where you get very good at something and you end up, because you're so good at it, you end up enjoying it. So there's this breakthrough period that you sort of need to have. But what sort of career advice do you have around, call it following your passion versus, doing something maybe a bit more on the practical side? And that seems to have been, it seems like you've discovered what you've enjoyed as you went along versus intentionally like, I love science and I'm only going to do this to some degree.
Yeah, no, I think that's definitely true. When I think back when I was a teenager and thought where I want to be, I thought eventually I'd probably, in my mind, I was sort of like, maybe I can end up, getting an MBA and then working in, and
really?
I was just really open to anything, right? As you can tell. So I definitely think that very often, a lot of opportunities came to me because folks thought, okay, Naila could be good at this. And I was sort of like, yeah, I think I could be good at this. And also, why not? I've never done this before. This is a new thing. It's a new thing I get to do. And so the combination of those two things, I think, did lead to me doing things that I may not have thought of myself to do. I might have picked if I had kind of like, I might have never been super proactive about taking certain paths, but realized that this could be something I could contribute in this way, and gone down it, and then progress and realize that, okay, I can grow and become even better at this through time. So I definitely would say I don't think one is better than the other. I think having passion is something I honestly personally admire, like people who could be very single-minded. I've never been that way, and I really admire people who are like that. But I would say that for folks who feel like they should have a passion, they should be super directed, and maybe it's also nice to have people realize that that's not a death knell. There's just, the world is changing so much. And so if you're somebody who is a bit more, let's just see where life takes me, life can also take you in very cool ways as well. Once you're just, flexible and open and don't, not intimidated by things. So certainly one thing I've always felt in my life is I am not afraid to fail. I'm not afraid to do something that's jump in a very new place, a very new work, and just not make it, because I was lucky enough that I knew that it wasn't going to have these super negative consequences for me, right? So why not, right? So why
Yes.
not? And yes, I think it's important to know that these two things, they're both really viable paths. And once you're somebody who is willing to learn, very open, willing to do the work, you'll be fine.
Perfect. Let's maybe put it to one. What piece of advice would you have for a high schooler, a college student, and a professional, given your understanding of kind of where machine learning is going and probably the metaverses to come, I would say. And I sort of align with you in terms of it's very hard to predict kind of where all of this stuff will go because it's rapidly changing. And I think maybe because you see it rapidly changing inside of Meta, you're like, hey guys, we don't know what's going to happen. What piece of advice do you have for those three groups of people?
So would you say in terms of like specific technical areas to focus on, or in terms of more like...
No, just in general, I think based on your own journey and your outlook on the future in terms of, hey, it's not concrete, it's quite fluid, and things that will get someone, I don't like to say the next level, but be impactful. Call it that.
So maybe one thing is, I guess it's obvious, is to, I think if you like, in order to create impact, I think it's just, you'd have to be very voracious about being informed, understanding what are the constant improvements and innovations and breakthroughs that are happening. And I think there are lots, and it's happening in a lot of different places. So I think it's good to get really connected in that space, whether it's signing up for newsletters, getting, like notifications when like specific things come out. I think it's keeping up with that is critical to start to give yourself a bit of intuition about what things are going to be impactful, what things might be coming down the line, who are the people who you should be like following to see what kind of work they're doing, people who you think who have very interesting ideas that you're interested in following, just like creating that kind of internally in your head network of like information network, basically. I think that was something that I would apply to everybody, like along that level. And I think something that high schoolers can do and sort of everybody can do. And then I would say to try to be as hands-on as you can. I think that's also something that I would recommend. It's something that I try to do and don't really do super successfully, but I do try to. And I would really advise of anybody that once again, that you because there's a lot of subtlety and there's a lot of, once again, intuition you can build by really working on these things. And I also think that's something high schools can do. By the way, there's a program that's unfortunately not available as far as I understand in the Caribbean, but it's just to give an illustration. So there's a program in the United States, which I think it'd be great if we could extend. It's called Major League Hacking, I believe. And so it's open to, for example, high school students. And I, for example, have somebody in my team who's working with four students, including high school students, some of them, working on machine learning projects for research and fair, right? So there's a lot of opportunity out there, a lot of interesting programs, try to get people in, try to create like a more diverse, more global set of people working in the problem. So I think there's a lot of opportunities for people to really get their hands on some of these technologies and the research.
Perfect. And what advice do you have for women in tech and maybe even more specifically machine learning? I interviewed Yinka from St. Martin, and she also works at Facebook AI, now Meta, and she gave some very interesting perspectives of the challenges that women might face that people might not necessarily think a lot about initially. So any thoughts there in terms of not how you navigate your career, but just good principles to run with?
Yeah, so I get this a lot, and I'm going to throw a bit of a curveball here.
Ooh, okay.
Because what I would, rather than sort of just give like advice, what I prefer to do is just give some validation to folks to say that if you're a woman in AI and you might feel maybe not welcome, you might feel not taken seriously, to really just keep in mind that it's not you, that in all likelihood is the environment. And so even if you feel a need to change yourself, and even if you feel a need to strategize about everything you say and everything you do, just keep in mind that that's not the way things should be, and this is an environment that is maybe in some ways somewhat hostile, and so it's not you, it's them, basically. So that's the advice I like to do, to have at least people, and that goes for many underrepresented groups, right?
Yes.
As much as you, practically speaking, many folks feel the need to kind of like conform and, do different things and adopt different strategies. And okay, I'm not going to speak this way. I'm not going to use this tone of voice. I'm going to do this and that. And that might be necessary for survival, but at least we should be aware that it's not right. And that you shouldn't feel like, that you should not be there. Right. So that's basically what I would say, just that folks to keep that in mind and not lose themselves in terms of trying to conform to something else.
That's extremely valuable perspective. Thanks for sharing that. How did your Caribbean heritage sort of contribute to success in your career? If any, if you can highlight it, if not, no worries. I think it's always something I'm quite curious about, just because in my own story, just like your ad math story, a big pivotal shift in my career was I just decided to go to San Francisco to volunteer for some really odd personal development conference, and with a ton of weird people there, but it was cool. But I get there and I go to San Francisco and I'm like, let me just go network. I don't know what's going to happen. And because I like to sort of keep my accent sort of going, just because it's like a signaling or sounding board whenever you go out there. And I heard another Trini accent, and I walked up to this guy and Hook, and he took us kind of under his wing and really positioned us with a lot of different opportunities that led to, like, Tech Beach in the Caribbean doing really well through Cal Maloney. So I always keep my eyes open for that Caribbean connection throughout. So any stories or advice you have there would be quite interesting.
Yeah, no, I don't know if I have too much to say. You mentioned in the beginning already, coming from a multicultural environment, like culture, and that just making you open. I do think that that's true. I think that, and it's made me very comfortable moving to different countries, I think, as well. It could be, some of that is personality, I think, too. But I think in the general, Caribbean folks are very used to the being in the diaspora, like, having different adventures, having everybody always knowing somebody who's not living there, right? Oh, yes, this person went to Canada, or this person's aunt went here, this person went there. So, and my whole family, right? Like my whole family also, I have like a lot of like extended family, as I think most Caribbean people do. So I think that just allows me to not be afraid to make that kind of change. And I think I have seen differences with folks who are like a lot of my European friends, right? Like I think there's much more of a yearning, I think, for home, I should say, or just at least a sense of, I don't want to go too far. I think a lot of Caribbean people have internalized that are used to kind of a system of, okay, I'm going to go home a couple times a year, but I'm going to have my life elsewhere and I'm going to move around, and that's okay. And I can still maintain those relationships because we've seen it. And I think if you're in a culture where maybe you're not used to seeing that, it's very strange, right? So I think, I think that has kind of allowed me to just not be afraid to move, I think, pretty vastly, compared to other people.
I like that. I never really thought about that. That's a good one to know, because maintaining relationships at home, and you're never really far from home to some degree in what you're saying. Cool. What are 3 principles you live by?
Oh, I didn't think about this.
It's a good one.
I'll do this on the fly. So let's say, once again, I don't have like it's something in front, like a post-it note being like 1, 2, 3. But if I can think, I value, I would say, really giving people the benefit of the doubts, being open to other points of view, being open to being wrong. I really try to do that. So I really try to back off. Like whenever there's something and it looks bad, or if somebody comes to me and says, oh, this person did this or said this, I really try to just take a step back and say, why would somebody say something like that? And I wonder how they would see it, and really try to be curious about the other point of view. So, and I think that comes into play quite a lot, managing different people. So that's one thing I try to do, to try to just be open to different perspectives and respectful of people's different perspectives. I value honesty. I try to be, as honest basically as a guideline for me. Try not to avoid having to ever, dissimulate about anything. So I definitely try to be in environments where that's possible, and I choose that like very, very proactively, right? That's something that comes into play when I think about if I wanted to go someplace. And then what else? I think specifically in this context, I would say integrity is important. It's related to honesty, I guess. But I think it's important thing for folks who do research, particularly, to have integrity, to be able to stand by the work that they do, and to put out work that stands the test of time. And so that's something that I value very much as well.
That's an interesting one when you think of standing the test of time. And I think that's something researchers end up thinking a lot about, right? This paper or this work that I'm doing, I'm adding to the body of knowledge, and you're continuously growing that. So I think that's a beautiful perspective for other people to maybe take away, like, hey, in my job, okay, I'm building this product, or you're doing this task to some degree. What's its maybe long-term lifetime value? Great. So you're a reader, and that's something, that's a skill set I truly admire, and low-key wish I had as an automatic type of behavior. It is something that, like you're saying, it's something you have to push through and sort of grow with over time. So the two quick questions there are, what 3 books you recommend? And the one after that would be, what are your paper reading strategies? Because I always like to learn people's. I know there's no shortcut to success, but I do think there's value in optimizing the way that you do certain things.
Yeah, I agree with that. But you have quite a big collection behind you there, so I'm not sure.
I do. It's definitely for show, because every time I watch it, I'm like, do I have to read this whole book, or do I just read this one thing?
But oh my gosh, I'm such a completist. I'm not the type of person that can read a book halfway. So I'm very careful which books I start reading. So 3 books I'd recommend. So I don't read actually a lot of books that are like, what's the future of intelligence and things like that. I don't read a lot of books like that. I read a lot of, honestly, a lot of fiction. In terms of books, I think that have shaped my general worldview, I would say the first one I would mention is a bit of a curveball, I guess. It's called The Affluent Society.
Ooh,
by John Kenneth Galbraith, by an economist, who wrote this book, I think, somewhere in the 1950s and 60s. And it's very much about what does it mean to want? What does it mean to need? How are these things created? And basically, just how can we keep in mind, as human beings, as people who are constructing an economy and constructing a society, the fact that we are constructing it, right? And these things aren't set in stone. Things that we consider to be wants and things that we consider to be needs are, there are a lot of things that are not fundamental. So the question, what do we consider to be fundamental in terms of what we need and what we want in society? So I found that very interesting. It always stuck with me, this book. I think it's just a great read for anyone, no matter where you are, like in terms of like, political, economic spectrum of thinking. Another one that I read relatively recently that I liked is a kind of, let's say not necessarily science fiction, but more futuristic kind of book called Parable of the Sower by Octavia Butler. What? So this is a book, it's a fictional book, basically placed, I think actually the time period is around now, but it's sort of like in the near future, in a somewhat dystopian, well, I shouldn't say somewhat, it's a pretty dystopian future. And this book really touched me because it was very prophetic. It's the kind of book, and not just this book, but the whole series. Well, the second book, actually, I don't think the third one ever came out. So it's very prophetic in terms of, let's say, demagoguery and tribalism, and like where this can really lead to certain societies. And this took place in the US as well. So it was very interesting to kind of see someone who can really see so clearly where the future can lead if we go down a path of just being very close-minded, in my point of view. So that was powerful for me for that reason. And then the last book, which I think I think this is actually, now that I thought about it, like this is actually very relevant to, let's say, machine learning, right? It's actually something that different people talk about quite a bit these days in terms of what's next for the machine learning community and the AI community. For example, Yoshua Bengio talks about this sometimes in his talks, which is like Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman.
Yes.
This book also, I think I think about this book has changed the way I think about human interactions completely, right? So
okay,
all the biases that we have. I have become very annoying in this way. Like my partner, he's just because I don't like to speculate anymore. I don't like. I just feel like there's so much ignorance in the world, and there's so many things that I just feel like so much of decision making we do is based on instincts and biases we have, and sort of like unexamined opinions, and the extent to which that governs our entire world. It was an eye opener for me. It's an eye opener for me. You know, when you read all these crazy anecdotes, like, if you're like a judge and you have to sentence somebody. If you sentence somebody when it's a Monday and you're tired, or you're depressed because it's Monday, or you haven't eaten and you're hangry, that this changes statistically in a significant way the severity of the sentences you give to people. I mean, it's just, and you tell yourself we run a society this way. So this is something that really sticks with me, and I try really, in my mind, it's just constant kind of like checking biases and not in myself and other people. So that's something that I found like it really stayed with me.
Great. And I think the kudos to myself for having that book, not having read it yet. Because I always hear good books. I'm like, I'm going to buy it. Okay. And someone's going to tell me to read it. And that's my filtering mechanism to push it up the queue. Okay, great. Yeah. I'll make sure to consume that one. And yeah, paper reading strategies.
So I don't think I have any good strategies here. I would say though, like when you were mentioning like getting some input, like some push to read, I was going to tell you that maybe you should just like start off with reading like the first chapter, and then it might hook you in. Yes. So I could probably extend that a little bit to just reading papers in general, that hooking into some part of the paper that drives your curiosity can pull you in, right? So if for whatever reason that something catches your eye, think about what is it that catches my eye, and rather than try to drag yourself through the parts that are boring, like maybe you don't want to start from the beginning, like start from the place that catches your eye. That could be like an interesting experiment that you want to understand better, and maybe you can just kind of skip to that section and you might be able to understand it. You might not, right? You might need to read the whole thing, but as much as possible, try to get to the parts that interest you, and that can that might help you circle back to kind of dig deeper. To be fair, that's just, honestly, it's not what I do. I just read papers that I find very interesting.
But you're a top to bottom, like you just boom, abstract, and you just run through it, or you kind of skim and.
Normally I read at least the introduction of a paper.
Okay.
Because at least in the types of conferences the papers that I read, this could depends on the way you are. But I think for most machine learning conferences, people try to really get it all there. So that gives you a lot. It gives you a lot anyways. Even if you don't read the whole paper, at least you kind of understand what is the idea these people are trying to do. Why do they think it'd be impactful? What's their hypothesis? What are they testing? And normally they give you some hints as to what the results were like. So you can get a lot from that, right? At least you can have in your mind somewhere, okay, somebody tried this thing. Somebody tried something in this space. So that's a lot of value anyway, even if you couldn't necessarily reproduce the work yourself, like by reading through the paper in detail. So, So yeah, I try to do that. Honestly, I don't even read much. Let's say I don't necessarily get to the end of the experimental section in a lot of papers, just simply because, unfortunately, I think there's like a big reproducibility crisis. And I think many papers, the numbers, you just ask yourself, right? Like, what was the seeding? Is this statistically significant, these differences? Is the difference due to this? Is it due to some strange thing in the middle of the code that's pushing your results up? There's just a lot of hidden details that can make changes in quantitative results. So unless I need to reproduce a paper myself or something, or we need to compare to it, it's something I take with a bit of a grain of salt, and I focus a bit more on the kind of the ideas and methods and things like this. So
great. Well, I want to thank you very much for your time today, and I've enjoyed sort of listening to your story, and I think it gives me even nice little inspiration from the perspective of, hey, I kind of don't know where the next leg of the journey will come from, and just kind of explore. So I'm grateful that in your career journey, that's very evident. That even if you don't plan, you can have a cool ride. So
well, thanks so much, Mark. It was really fun. You asked really great questions, and I had a really great time discussing this. So thanks again for the invitation.
Great. You have a great day. Bye.
You too. Take care. Bye bye.